interrupting your lunch with a discussion about war crimes, but this is the way it is. First of all, I'd like to thank Ed Barrett for inviting me to speak. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been here a number of times before, and this is the first time I've honoured to have a keynote. And I'd also like to give a shout out actually to John Doris and Nancy Snow, both of whom contributed in important ways to the development of the book from which my talk is coming from. So I'd like to thank them both for their contribution, and their work actually really did assist in the development of our ideas. So the talk I'm giving today is from sort of the first half of a book that myself and my co-author Matthew Talbot published. It came out last year, and actually did get a shout out to Doris's talk as well, which was very nice. And let me just get my... So that's the book. And the book basically looks both at the causes of war crimes but also about moral responsibility for war crimes. I'm not going to be talking much about moral responsibility today, so I'm going to focus mainly on the material from the first half of the book, which is looking about, well, how do we understand the causes of war crimes? And then I'll talk a little bit also about what that might lead us to think in terms of possible prevention of war crimes. So very broadly, the outline of my talk is as follows. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm calling sort of a fairly common approach to war crimes, which is similar to what John Doris mentioned in terms of an individualised approach to thinking about war crimes. I'll then describe what we call a situationist approach to war crimes. I'll raise a problem with that view, a couple of problems with that view, and then talk about the view that we defend in the book, which links the commission of war crimes to a process of moral legitimisation. So one of the key insights that we develop in our view is to understand war crimes requires understanding how war crimes can come to be seen as compatible with or even required by moral virtue and moral principles. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the implications of my view, particularly in relation to thinking about preventing war crimes. And that's something I'd certainly welcome feedback and suggestions about. That's something that we only touch on at the very end of the book. Okay, so what's a common approach to war crimes? Well, it's a common assumption that you see sometimes in literature about war crimes. I think this is also reflected in the kinds of case studies that are often used to discuss war crimes. For example, the case study of My Lai and case studies from Abu Ghraib, where there seems to be an assumption that we're looking at war crimes resulting from the failure of individual military personnel. Perhaps, say, in failures of self-control in the face of extraordinary pressures, for example, maybe failures of leadership, maybe failures of empathy. But there's a particular narrative about war crimes it's fairly consistent over some of the literature in military ethics training that tends to characterise war crimes in this way, as individual failures. And of course, if you characterise war crimes primarily in terms of individual failures, when I say primarily, because some of these accounts do, of course, acknowledge that there are institutional factors at play. But if you do characterise war crimes primarily in terms of the failures of the individual soldier or combatant to uphold the laws of war, say, in the face of pressure, then that's going to have implications for how you think about prevention. So, driving, if you're basing the narrative on the individualised picture, then prevention is going to also focus on the individual. So you're going to see arguments in favour of increasing or changing different kinds of character development training. And both Nancy Sherman and Nancy Snow talk about perhaps incorporating Stoic ethics in various forms into military training as a way of cultivating individual traits such as empathy or self-control in military personnel, with the aim that this will better enable them to resist the kind of pressures that might result in war crimes. Other authors have talked about, say, training in moral deliberation, but the kind of focus, or the focus here on these kind of prevention strategies is very much about cultivating individual traits, individual habits, with the idea that this will actually help prevent war crimes. So this is a view that we challenge in our book, actually. And one of the reasons why we challenge it is because we think this actually ignores the way in which war crimes can actually be seen as compatible with virtue and military principles. But I'll come to that in a moment. But first I want to talk a little bit about a conception of war crimes that might support this sort of individualised narrative to some degree, or at least offer a sort of related account of the causes of war crimes. So this is what I'm calling the situationist view. Now, situationism has a number of different meanings in philosophy and in psychology. Here we're drawing on a paper from John Doris and Dominic Murphy from 2007, in which they argue that, or they give us a picture of the causes of war crimes based on two different kinds of situational forces. So on the one hand, we have what they call sort of heat of battle situational forces. So these are cases where war crimes might occur as a result of extreme fatigue or fear or anger. They're characteristic of, the extraordinarily confusing conditions of a combat battlefield. But they also, and they're unusual actually in talking about this, and this is something that's important about their work, they also say, well, there are other kinds of situational factors that can lead to military personnel committing war crimes well outside traditional battlefield contexts. So they talk about these long-term diffuse situational forces. They call them distal pressures. And these include things like propaganda. So exposure, for example, to racialised propaganda about the enemy, training in obedience to authority, dehumanisation of the enemy, group bonding, and so forth. So there's a range of practices that can occur during military training and culture, which might, particularly in combination then with battlefield conditions, lead to a situation where military personnel have degraded normative competence. Normative competence is a term that basically refers to an individual's capacity to understand, deliberate, and act on moral reasons. So Zoros and Murphy argue that these different kinds of situational forces can lead to military personnel committing war crimes, in part because military personnel can come to believe that war crimes are actually permissible. Right? So when you have this combination of propaganda and, say, dehumanisation, it can lead military personnel perhaps to believe that it's permissible to, say, torture certain kinds of prisoners of war or kill civilians in some cases. And they draw conclusions about the moral responsibility of military personnel that I won't talk about in much detail here, but we do discuss in the book. Okay, so this is the kind of situationist picture. And what's interesting here too is that they do talk about the internal states of military personnel, so their beliefs and attitudes, for instance. But under this picture, those internal states are actually themselves a product of external forces, right? That their military personnel's beliefs and attitudes are shaped by these external forces, leading them to believe that certain kinds of actions are permissible. Okay, so there's a couple of problems we think with this situationist view. So the first and I think probably the most serious problem is, using a phrase from psychologist Thomas Glass, the smile problem. And this is a problem because it's referring to the fact that, even in cases where perpetrators have been exposed to the same kinds of situational forces in combat and during training in military culture, you still have a lot of difference in the way perpetrators actually behave in the commission of war crimes. And you also have, of course, there are military personnel who don't commit war crimes. So there's the problem of refusers and resistors. So how can a situationist account explain the difference between the enthusiastic perpetrator, the perpetrator who perhaps goes even beyond what they've been ordered to do, and the perpetrator who commits war crimes but does so reluctantly, and then the person who actually refuses to commit any war crime at all. And you see all of those differences when you look at the commission of war crimes. So why is this a problem with the situationists? Well, again, if they've all been exposed to the same kind of situational forces, then how do we explain these individual differences? It looks like we might have to then refer to some kind of individual differences in character. So that's one problem. A second problem is that it seems to be very difficult to falsify the situationist view. So here's what a situationist might say in relation to the smile problem. Well, the difference between perpetrator A and perpetrator B, the enthusiastic perpetrator and the reluctant perpetrator, that can be traced back to some, seemingly minor difference in the situational forces to which they were exposed. So it's always going to be possible to refer back to some previously unrecognised or undiagnosed situational difference to provide an explanation for the difference in behaviour sort of on the ground. So that makes it seem hard to see what would count as evidence against a situationist view. And that seems to be, I think, a problem with the theory if it's effectively impossible to provide evidence against it. And finally, and this is sort of key for our view, we think that the way that it frames an individual's beliefs, goals and values in relation to actions is mistaken. That it ignores the fact that an individual's beliefs, goals and values play a really important, significant role in understanding what they do, and that these beliefs, goals and actions are not just imposed from without, which they seem to be in some of the situationist pictures. So the argument that we develop actually takes point number 3 as sort of a key starting point, that we think it's to understand individual perpetrators, you have to actually also understand their individual goals, values and beliefs, and how they make sense of their actions in light of those. So, in our view, one of the things that really important starting points in understanding war crimes, this is why also we find the sort of common approach, the individualised approach, the view of war crimes as failures, a sort of problematic way to start thinking about war crimes. And this is the fact that many war crimes perpetrators actually see themselves as acting in accordance, not just maybe with moral principles, but actually with moral virtues. So the idea that moral virtues have a sort of universally understood meaning or application is something that we think is problematic. So when you look at war crimes, and this is particularly true of what we call institutionalised war crimes. Right? So we're particularly interested in war crimes that occur as part of an institutionalised policy. So that could be an institutionalised genocidal policy or a torture policy such as the Bush administration's torture policy post 9/11. And they're different from what we might call heat of battle war crimes. So in heat of battle war crimes, so the massacre at Haditha would be an example, and the massacre by Sergeant Robert Bale of 16 Afghani citizens would count perhaps. It's a war crime, but the perpetrator doesn't explain or justify their beliefs by reference to moral principles. Right? So we're particularly interested in institutionalised cases, and in these cases you do see frequent reference to moral principles and moral virtues as part of what is taken to justify the commission of war crimes. So you see references to self-control and honour and duty and loyalty by perpetrators of war crimes as being things that actually they see as consistent with their behaviour. So that means we can't start off assuming that a perpetrator of war crimes had to overcome moral resistance to do what they have to do. So this is a quote from Welser. We can't assume they had to overcome prior morally motivated inhibitions. There may have been no inhibitions in the way of their actions. Right? If they believed that what they're doing was right and they believed it was what they needed to do out of some sense of integrity, there is no morally motivated inhibition standing in their way. So the two ways in which war crimes are given meaning that we develop in our account are both at the level of the individual, but also at the level of social and cultural frameworks. And so understanding war crimes requires understanding moral legitimisation at both of those levels. So again, thinking just about the individual is going to miss out the significance of social and cultural frameworks in providing justifications and sort of morally motivated support for the commission of war crimes. Okay, so we can talk about war crimes at two different levels. So the first level is at the level of culture, and here we draw on some work from Helinda Power-Studer and David Velleman about the social articulation of morality. So the idea of social articulation of morality is that moral concepts, and these include concepts like justice and equality and respect, but also virtue concepts such as duty and honour, they don't have a universally accepted meaning. The way in which they are interpreted and understood by individuals depends on the social framework that is available to those individuals to make sense of those ideas. So moral concepts have to be socially articulated, in order for individuals to internalise, understand and apply them. And it's also the case that our social and cultural frameworks will shape what we see as being morally relevant in the situations in which we act. So Power-Studer and Velleman call that habits of moral perception. So even the things that we pick out as being relevant to the moral concepts we're considering is not something which is sort of universally true in all cases. It's shaped by these social articulations of morality. At the individual level then, perpetrators interpret social articulations of morality through the lens of their unique beliefs, goals and self-conceptions. And I'm going to give you sort of two examples of both at the cultural level and the individual level of how this is going to help make sense of the commission of war crimes. So here's an example at the level of culture. Alexander Hinton is an anthropologist who wrote a very fascinating book. If you're interested in reading about genocide in your spare time, it's a really fascinating book about the rise of the Khmer Rouge and the Cambodian genocide. And what's very interesting about the Khmer Rouge is how they quite intentionally adopted pre-existing cultural and religious concepts and modified those concepts in ways that made the genocidal project that they were engaged in seem consistent with Cambodian values and history, and therefore easier for Cambodians to accept. So they, for example, took a lot of Buddhist concepts and then reframed them in support of the genocidal project. So, for example, mindfulness, which is a well-known Buddhist concept, was interpreted to mean cultivating your revolutionary consciousness. So that was the virtue of mindfulness in the Khmer Rouge's ideology. Letting go of anger or letting go of attachment was also construed in a different way. So think about attachment. Again, Buddhist teachings do say it was important to let go of attachment. In the Khmer Rouge's reinterpretation of that idea, letting go of attachment enabled people to then turn in their loved ones and families. So again, this appeal to this concept, which is already deeply embedded in Cambodian society, helped sustain and allow people to make sense of their participation in a genocidal project. Self-control here. Again, we might think of self-control as a trait that would help people resist the temptation or the pressure to participate in war crimes. But here we see an example of self-control being used as a trait to support and strengthen the commitment to commission of war crimes. So torturers in the Khmer Rouge were very taught that to be a good torturer you had to be self-controlled. So discipline and self-control were actually traits that facilitated the use of torture rather than actually preventing the use of torture. And that's actually something you see in accounts of torturers from other countries as well. So it's a fairly common approach to state torture to interpret it as being part of a sort of self-controlled, trained, disciplined mindset. So this is a quote from the Khmer Rouge's torture manual, which again, if you are interested in reading about torture in your spare time, you can actually find that online. This is a training manual for torturers. It says, torture is not something you do out of individual anger. It's something that we're professional, we're trained, we're self-controlled, and that's what makes us good torturers. But this sort of macro-level explanation isn't going to account for the individual differences that I talked about before in the context of a smile problem. We still want to know, okay, so this makes sense of why you might see self-control, mindfulness being construed in such a way to lend support for the commission of war crimes. But how does that explain how these individuals then internalise and act on those ideas? And Hinton does talk about the fact that there were, again, quite dramatic differences in the way perpetrators behaved, and some perpetrators went well beyond, in fact, what they were ordered to do. So he does talk about some perpetrators of genocide engaging in cannibalism, which was not part of the Khmer Rouge's explicit project. So again, we want some explanation of this individual difference, and this macro-level explanation is only part of the picture. So when we turn to the role of the individual, we draw here on a theory from social psychology known as CAPS, which is Cognitive Affective Personality System. I'm only going to give you a very, very brief overview of this theory right now, but the basic idea is that, character can't really be understood independently from situation. But unlike the traditional situationist, it's not the case that there is a person who has character who is overwhelmed by a situation. Rather, to make sense of what a situation is, we actually already need to know how the person in that situation understands the meaning of the situation. What does it mean to them? So in a sense, there isn't this clear distinction between situation and person to begin with. Right? What the situation is depends on the individual's construal. So the principle of construal is a key principle in CAPS theory. So that means when we ask, how to make sense of an individual's behaviour, we can't just look at the objective features of the situation and say, oh, it's a situation that requires honesty. What we have to do is say, well, how does she understand the situation? And how do her actions make sense to her, given her pre-existing beliefs, goals, and self-conceptions? So we use 2 case studies in the book to try and understand how this idea, or illustrate how this idea can help us understand individual perpetrator behaviour against the background of the social articulation of morality at the level of culture. So these are 2 case studies that Paul Suter and Velleman discuss, and they're quite fascinating. So Felix Landau and Karl Kretschmer both, one was in a Einsatzgruppen unit, and Karl Kretschmer was in a Sonderkommando unit. They were both involved in the shooting of Jewish civilians in Poland. Right? And unusually, there's testimony at the time available. So Felix Landau kept a diary, Karl Kretschmer wrote letters to his family. So we have a rare insight in how perpetrators at the time were thinking and construing the meaning of their actions. One of the things that's difficult about war crimes is that perpetrators who are, say, on trial for war crimes are not likely to be forthcoming necessarily about their true motivations and thoughts about their behaviour. So what we see here is two perpetrators who are exposed to very similar situational forces, very similar cultural narratives, very similar combat experience, had very different interpretations of what they were involved in. So Felix Landau, in his diary, he doesn't express any outright anti-Semitism, actually. In fact, he's pretty unhappy about the fact that he's being required to shoot innocent civilians. But he's not unhappy because he thinks it's necessarily immoral. He's unhappy because it's not really what he thinks a soldier should be doing. So in his view, being a soldier is about fighting on a battlefield and you're fighting other soldiers. That's what soldiering is about. Here he is, shooting women and children. And so he's not very happy about that. But again, his objection is not so much moral as it is, this is not the job I signed up for, right? But for him, being a good soldier is very important to his self-conception. So in his diary, he talks a lot about how other people admired his work. He sort of talks about how, is this a job he's been asked to do this job? He doesn't think it's very kind of, soldierly, but he's going to do it and do it to the best of his ability. He would far rather good, honest, open combat, but, here he is following his orders. So his self-conception as a good worker means that he's actually quite dedicated to fulfilling his task, right? Even though he thinks it's not particularly soldierly. But it also means he's fairly critical of sadistic or enthusiastic shooters, right? He sees people who take pleasure in killing as also being unsoldierly. So for him, his self-conception as being a hard-working, good worker really shapes his attitude towards what he's doing. In contrast, Karl Kretschmer really believed quite sincerely, as far as we can tell, that the Jews pose an existential threat to the survival of the German people. So that was a narrative that was a really important part of the social articulation of morality that was available in Nazi Germany. This construction of the genocide of the Jews as war against an enemy, right? And so that narrative really resonated with Karl Kretschmer. So he writes in letters to his family, "My comrades are literally fighting for the existence of our people." But unlike Landau, he finds the killing really, really distressing. So he talks about struggling with his repulsion of killing, and he writes to his daughter, "It is a weakness not to be able to stand the sight of dead people." So he's construing his revulsion against killing as a sign of individual weakness on his part, a failure to live up to the sort of duty and honour required of a good soldier. So the best way to overcome that weakness is to do it more often, i.e. kill more often. Right. But he also reassures his daughter. He writes, I've got the quote here, I shouldn't chuckle, it's not actually funny, but it is. He says, "You can trust your daddy, he thinks about you all the time and is not shooting immoderately." So again, it's very important for him that he sees himself as straddling a line between being a kind of, again, overly enthusiastic shooter and being a coward. Right. So again, I think that what you see here is, again, two individuals exposed to very similar kind of social narratives that were available at the time, but interpreting the meaning of their actions in very different ways that help us understand and make sense of their individual behaviour. Okay, so the implications then of this account, and I've managed to lose, here it is, in the sort of upshot of our view, is that this kind of case study helps us see that war crimes are going to result, not from specifically individual failures, but interactions between perpetrators' individual goals, values and beliefs. So we saw with Landau and Kretschmer how their individual self-conceptions in particular shaped the way they understood and thought about what they did, but also the available social articulations of morality. So again, Kretschmer in particular latches on to the narrative of the genocide of the Jews as a war against an enemy, and the characterisation of the Jews as an enemy and a threat to Germany. And that then also, of course, shaped his understanding of what he was doing. So that means that many war crimes, aren't really, it's not helpful to think of many war crimes as failures of self-control. And if we start from the assumption that war crimes occur from these individual failures, we're missing this picture of this interaction between this social articulations of morality and these moral frameworks and the role they play in legitimising war crimes. Right? We have to really start with that recognition to understand how war crimes can come to be seen as compatible with moral virtues. So again, Kretschmer, believes that killing innocent people is in fact what is morally required to do. So he's bought into that narrative. So I think it's also important, it's not just that moral frameworks play a role in legitimising war crimes, but it can be the case then that concepts of moral virtue actually facilitate war crimes, can actually lend a kind of support to these objectionable kinds of moral beliefs by being construed as necessary for the commission of war crimes. So again, if we focus on self-control, like understanding how self-control can be construed in such a way that it's viewed as a virtue of being a torturer, right? Not a virtue that would prevent torture. So we do, in the last part of the book, talk a little bit about, well, how would our account, what implications would follow from our account in terms of preventing war crimes? And I think, John Doris raised some similar ideas, but I do think there's a role for education here as well. One thing I do think is that it's very important to educate military personnel about the causes of war crimes, but to do so in such a way that sort of, really acknowledges and addresses the fact that these are often institutionally based crimes, driven by political and social narratives, right? So again, I think the US torture program is a good case for that. And I think if you're teaching about the US torture program, focusing on Abu Ghraib is going to miss that picture, right? What you should be focusing on is Guantanamo Bay and the social and political narratives that sustain the support for the program as a whole, right? So that, the way we teach about war crimes, I think, needs to start from that recognition, and also start from the recognition that the good guys can commit war crimes, right? That the people who commit war crimes aren't, terrible necessarily, psychopaths, they weren't just weak-willed or weakness of character, but rather, again, these are institutionally sustained narratives that support the commission of war crimes. And they're narratives that, we have engaged in the past. So there has to be that kind of acknowledgement, I think, in teaching military personnel about war crimes. And as part of that, I think it's also important to recognise that these sort of dangerous articulations of morality, these narratives can become dominant narratives relatively easily. Now, of course, in a democracy, there's more back and forth, about the narratives about, for example, the use of torture than you would find in a totalitarian state. But in terms of the dominant narrative, so after the Bush administration, the narrative, for example, of terrorism as an existential threat, the narrative that torture was necessary, even virtuous, that became a dominant narrative, even though there was objections to it. So it can happen relatively easily, and those narratives can be fairly readily accepted by the institutions tasked with implementing these kinds of policies. So I think recognising that is really important, acknowledging that, and encouraging dissenting or opposing narratives is important within the institutions, particularly that are most affected by these dominant social and political narratives. But finally, I really think, and more I sort of think about this, all of what I've just said is basically moot if there is no accountability for war crimes. We can have as much ethics education as we could possibly wish. We could have 24/7 ethics training, virtue ethics all over the place, and it's just not going to make any difference if there is no punishment and accountability for war crimes. And it's something that I found always very disheartening about studying war crimes is the lack of accountability. So again, think about the US torture program. Who ended up in jail? A couple of people from Abu Ghraib. That's it. Not the psychologists who were involved in crafting the interrogation methods, not the sort of intelligence officials who were actually carrying it out, not the individual interrogators at Guantanamo Bay, no one. So that failure of accountability and that failure to sort of talk about that lack of accountability, I think itself sends a message that's really problematic and sustains the commission of war crimes in the long term. Unless there is a clear and committed refusal to allow war crimes to go unpunished, then I really think it's going to be very difficult ultimately to resist the imposition of narratives that could sustain the commission of war crimes over time. So on that cheerful note, I will wind up and open up the floor to questions.
I have a question. So can these narratives become so dominant that they serve as excuses? And therefore, what about
So
accountability?
you're sneaking in a question about moral responsibility now, which is just not fair, because I
Yeah.
wasn't talking about responsibility.
Because
No,
what about
my view,
accountability?
no, I don't think they act as excuses.
No.
Now, what we did see actually, so the Senate report on torture, right, was a kind of accountability in the sense there was some public acknowledgement. But, you know, Obama's response was some of the narrative was, well, they thought they were doing the right thing, right? But that narrative itself, aside from being just an extremely common kind of justificatory narrative that you see in response to war crimes elsewhere, in our view, and this is a view we do defend in the book, which I can't go into now, you know, the fact that you believe you're doing the right thing does not provide you with a moral excuse, right? It just doesn't. You can believe you're doing the right thing and be committing morally, you know, highly morally atrocious acts that display complete indifference to the welfare of others. And so, you know, if your actions are displaying this indifference to the welfare of others or act of hostility or other objectionable attitudes, that's grounds for holding you accountable, even if you believe that what you did was wrong. I'd also say, not for nothing, we would not accept that excuse from, say, the torturers who worked for Saddam Hussein or the Khmer Rouge. We wouldn't say, oh, well, they believed that they were doing the right thing, so, you know, no punishment necessary. So, yeah, we want to be consistent as well in our judgments about accountability.
Just a quick question
Sure.
about the notion of accountability.
Yeah.
And I think I understood you as saying it's like an expressivist kind of function.
Right. Well, it serves a number of functions, but yes.
Okay, and that's the first part, and then I think this ties up back to Ed's question. If it serves that expressivist function, that's a whole other reason for not allowing something like ignorance as an excuse.
Right.
Because it's not about necessarily the individual's moral excuses that they have available to them, culpable versus exculpating ignorance. There's a different function that accountability might be serving.
Right, I think that's a really good point. I mean, we also should think too about accountability as serving as a way of honouring and respecting the victims of war crimes. Right? So a failure to hold war criminals accountable is also a failure to take seriously the harm that was done to the victims of war crimes. And you see this, of course, in non-military contexts. So a failure to punish perpetrators of sexual assault sends a message about the relative value of the perpetrator's interests versus the interests of victims. So I think there really is an expressivist function here that that can come apart and could justify legal accountability, even in cases where there is someone believed that they were doing the right thing. Yes.
So this might seem a little naive, but it sounds like in the case studies that you gave, you're talking about individuals or large sets of individuals maybe, but individuals nonetheless who already had some troubling tendencies when it came to their morality. For example, Felix and Carl, you were talking about how they were able to fix their actions with their larger beliefs about things based on the prevailing social articulation of morality. But one of them was willing to write, Carl was willing to write to his daughter.
Oh, yeah, it wasn't shooting him moderately.
Exactly, and then Felix was specifically talking, like he was somehow able to get this killing down to a science and things like that. It seems to me that maybe these kinds of people, in some sense, do transcend their situation. They are people who would be willing to kill, or people who are willing to see mindfulness, which is a pretty established Buddhist idea, as far as I'm aware, and misconstrue that as turning oneself into a revolutionary. If you're willing to do that, maybe it doesn't matter as much, from what I can see, what kind of situation you're in. Maybe that seems a little more internal to me. Those are seem like deliberate misinterpretations for the purpose of advancing your own core, I want to do some bad things.
Okay, so the optimistic view of the cases I presented is actually a view that you're suggesting, which is that really what's going on with the Landau and Kretschmer is that they had some pre-existing problematic character traits, and then they adopted these ways of thinking as a way of giving legitimacy to their pre-existing destructive tendencies or desires that were problematic. I call it the optimistic case because that then means that the problem isn't really with the interaction between social articulations of morality, but rather it's just that it's a sort of slightly bad apple view. Right? Bad apples given a framework in which to express their bad appleness, whatever that means. I just think that's not true, actually. And I'm basing that on a lot of research I've done on torturers. So, my dissertation and my first book was about the training of torturers, military torturers. And, consistently research on torturers finds no, pre-existing sort of abnormal traits, right? So locating the reason why someone becomes a torturer into, well, they must have had some pre-existing sadism, say, or desire to inflict harm or something, just doesn't seem to be, there's no support for that view. But of course, it's much more confronting to then consider the possibility that maybe Landau and Kretschmer weren't abnormal. They didn't have some pre-existing deviant psychology that then was given a kind of framework. Rather, they were just as ordinary as anyone in this room. And that's, of course, very confronting because it means that, well, what's to stop any one of us then from adopting these kinds of frameworks in that kind of context? And so that's also, I think, the challenge posed by war crimes. And it's also a challenge that I think we have to take on if we're thinking seriously about prevention, which is like, yeah, you know, good people, people who we would see as being normal, healthy, you know, kind people, can become perpetrators of war crimes through some of these mechanisms that I've described. Right. So I guess I think I sort of disagree as an explanation. Yes. Oh, yes.
Isn't that the most disturbing thing, though, is the normalcy of the people that commit war crimes? You know, Hannah Arendt had a great way of describing
Right.
it, right? The banality.
Yeah.
This is a guy that did not look like a monster. You know, Himmler was a chicken farmer. I mean, you have, it's the normalcy, you know, you said it here, the good
Yeah.
guys can commit war crimes. And in many cases, it's just a normal person, quote
Yeah.
unquote. And that, to me, seems to be something that we need to address ourselves as a military institution, because it means that none of us are completely and utterly divorced from having those kinds of tendencies. And it's a side of human nature that we don't like to admit and don't like to deal with. But it seems to me that is that by accurately.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think it also requires a humility. That's right. It's a recognition of, well, we, you know, it's in some ways to characterise all kinds of perpetrators as monsters or even as just sort of abnormal, is to then evade the challenge of looking at ourselves and saying, well, how could I become complicit in these kinds of crimes? Because people have. You know, I'm sure the thousands of people who were involved in the torture program, I doubt any of them, you know, started off thinking, well, hey, finally I've got my chance to commit acts of torture. You know, they probably saw themselves as good people. So I think there's also a tendency in human psychology, which is a powerful force in this process, which is that we really want to see ourselves as good people. So we're highly motivated to reconcile our actions with a self-conception that's consistent with viewing ourselves as a good person. And so we see Landau and Kretschmer doing that exact thing in different ways. I'm a good worker, I'm tying my identity to being a good worker. I'm protecting the German people from extinction, so I'm tying my identity to that, and that's making what I do consistent with a self-conception of myself as a good person. And so understanding that drive, I think, is also really important. Right? It's very rare that you get war crimes in this kind of context, at least, driven by people who are like, I'm evil, and I know I've got a chance to be evil. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. There has to be that acknowledgement at institutional level.
One last thing, if you remember too, when Arendt wrote her book, there was a great deal of response to it was not positive.
Right.
Because people thought that she was sort of abrogating the Germans from their responsibility, because of course Eichmann had to be a monster, because no one but a monster could do that.
Right, right.
So, you know, there still is this, and now it sounds like, you know, you're dealing with the same kind of pieces here. People, we don't want to look at it that way. And maybe
No, that's right.
We ought to think about teaching at this level.
Yeah, I agree. I think that should be the point at which you start teaching about these. So there's a bunch of questions, and I think I only have a couple of... Ed's pointing fingers in random directions. I don't know what that means.
A couple more questions.
Two more questions. Okay. There was a hand up at the back before, so I wanted to come back.
Just a comment on Plato's two horses. You guys acknowledge
Okay,
that,
yep.
right? By feeding those chariots. So I hear it's institutional responsibility to create a narrative that helps people understand their hierarchy of loyalties, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm in a conflict, these moral pieces are combating each other, I know what my community or my institution says is more important than you know. Is that kind of what you're suggesting?
Well, I'm not sure that I want to see it necessarily as a conflict, because in some of these cases there isn't a conflict, but in the individual between conflicting loyalties. Now, in some cases there is. So, I mean, I think Kretschmer is an example of a kind of conflict, right? But I don't think I would describe it as a conflict of loyalties or hierarchy of loyalties. There's a conflict between how he felt actually killing people, like his moral distress, and his belief that the killing was necessary. And so he's trying to reconcile those two things. There is no such conflict in Landau. actually. So he, we don't see, okay, he's like, I wish I was on the battlefield. That would be much more what I think, I wish I was just good on this combat, but hey, I'm doing this job and I'll do it well. So I'm not sure that the kind of model of conflict is necessarily the best way to describe this dynamic. I think it can describe some cases.
Just thinking about your solution,
Oh, I see.
of how to approach it.
Yeah.
Just saying, here we are as an institution, here's where you should be lining up, and when things conflict, here's where they should fall.
When you mean things conflict, what do you mean by things conflict? Which things? Like,
Small gray areas or things.
Okay.
You get someplace, I'm told a kid not to kill, but here I am.
Right.
To do that, that's moral.
Right. Again, it depends on whether we think that inhibition has already been overridden or not, right? Because again, as Welzer says, we can't assume that there is this inhibition that has to be overcome in all these cases. And these narratives are very powerful. I mean, you think about the narrative of killing in war in general, is that, well, you've got to kind of overcome their initial resistance to killing, but once you accept the justifications for killing in war, and I'm not talking about war crimes, I'm talking about legitimate killing of enemy combatants, it's not clear that necessarily is a conflict from that point on, if that's accepted. Now, there might be a conflict in the sense that you might need to kind of do some work to be able to do it efficiently and not be destroyed by it. That may not be viewed as a moral conflict, though. That might be viewed more as a kind of, how do I become better at this, rather than there are two competing moral principles at stake here. So I think, I do think that, thinking about where your loyalty should lie is one important tactic. But I do think circling back, again, in the absence of accountability, it's not going to do a lot, right? And also I just want to say, by accountability, I don't necessarily mean criminal punishment, although I do mean that. But I also mean things like even tribunals, even sort of public acknowledgement is part of being accountable. So there's one more question I'm allowed to ask. I'd like to ask a midshipman, perhaps.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
One midshipman.
Okay. And then one midshipman.
Thank you. Do you think that the morality of individuals like Felix and Carl are permanently damaged from the situations that they're in, or that once they leave those situations, they can recover?
That's a really interesting question, and I don't know. I don't know what happened to them, actually, after the war. So I do think, pessimist in me says there are some war crimes perpetrators who never feel troubled about what they did, who continue to hold on to a self-conception in which what they did was permissible or justified or necessary. There are others who, I think, struggle after the fact to make sense of their participation. And I think that raises really interesting questions about the possibility of, say, forgiveness and repentance, which are outside the scope of what I'm doing here. But I don't think, so the pessimist is me, I would like to think that that people who commit war crimes are, in some sense, permanently harmed by that. There's some sort of psychic wound. I don't think that's actually true, though, in many cases. I think our ability to reconcile doing terrible things with our self-conception is pretty strong in some cases. And so someone can go their whole life and think, yeah. And you do see this, actually, unfortunately, in interviews sometimes with former Germans who were complicit in different ways in the Holocaust, who are like, oh, that was the good days. So there's actually a book called The Good Old Days about people talking about their experiences in the war, Germans, and saying, yeah, that was, there's not even any acknowledgement that there was any harm that was done. So, yeah. Okay, so I have to wind up then. Thank you.